Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to present the much-beloved adaptation, Lady with a Dog, from Chekhov and directed by Iosif Kheifits. This film from 1960 was a worldwide success. We'll be talking about it as an adaptation and as a product of the Soviet era after today's screening. Joining us will be George Malko, a distinguished screenwriter and novelist who's also a translator of Chekhov. Now, journey to Russia in Lady with a Dog. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see what many people think is a classic adaptation of Chekhov's Lady with a Dog. There's a lot of issues here about translation, both to the screen, but also translation from one language or culture to another. And it's a real pleasure to have with us today to talk about those issues, George Malko. George is a working screenwriter, published novelist, but he's also has some other qualifications that bring him to us today. He is a translator of Chekhov. His book, A Tragic Man Despite Himself, from the Green Integer Press, is a collection of the complete short dramatic works of Chekhov, including 5 works that have never been published before in English. In addition to that, as recently as 2009 up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Nora Theater Company performed his new translation of The Cherry Orchard, a translation I believe praised by the Boston Globe.
Thank you.
Well, you've been not only translating but thinking about translations of Chekhov for quite a while, George. So let's start at this sort of most general level. When you sit down to translate from Russian into English the work of Chekhov, what are some of the, at least initially, linguistic and cultural challenges a translator faces?
Well, we all know the word translator and we all know the word interpreter. And at the United Nations, we hear the phrase simultaneous interpretation. But in fact, if you think about it less than a second, you realize that interpretation is what you talk about an acting performance.
Right.
So-and-so interpreted this role. So are we really interpreting a foreign language, or are we trying to find a way to render it, in this instance, into English,
right,
in a way that is as reasonably faithful to the intentions of the author? And you well know, because of your knowledge of South American literature, that the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez always spoke of the equally great translator Gregory Rabasas as almost his collaborator.
Right, the translator of 100 Years of Solitude.
Yes. And from Russian, particularly with Chekhov, I found that it was particularly important not to mess with it, because the fact is it isn't broken. Now, through the annals of translation, particularly of Chekhov, one could write an extensive study of the fact that the first translations, which were done by the English,
right,
presumed that being Russian, Chekhov had to be depressing, certainly unhappy. And it was this image that the Brits had of the impenetrable Russian winters and the people sitting around unable to make up their minds about whether they should go to Moscow or not. 3 sisters.
Right.
The fact is, as I learned at an early age from my father, who reminded me that the main plays of Chekhov's are comedies. Okay. And he intended them as comedies. He intended them in the comedic sense of maybe Balzac's human comedy.
Okay, yeah.
That is, life is funny. It isn't ridiculous, although it has ridiculous moments, but there is humor in it. And in The Lady with the Little Dog, there is humor. The question of how you put something like that on the screen, and particularly the realization of a short story,
right,
becomes a wholly different challenge. because the essence of a short story, in a way, is the realization of one idea
Right.
with economy.
Let me go back to his language just
Yes.
just for a second for Chekhov. I'm reminded of the fact that when my own grandmother went back to her native Finland after 56 years, we asked some cousins how her Finnish was, and they said it was terrific because they didn't have many opportunities to listen to the Finnish of a 17-year-old girl from 1904, which is when the curtain went down on her language acquisition. So are there historical issues attached to Chekhov of the way of his language?
I think there are.
Okay.
And I had a personal experience of that. I learned how to speak and read and write Russian from my parents from the time I was 5 years old. My parents had classical Russian educations. My father was considerably older than my mother. So he studied at the conservatory in St. Petersburg. He was a musician. But when they taught me Russian, it was the Russian that they knew.
Oh, okay.
So that when I have worked in first the Soviet Union and then Russia, on a couple of occasions, I have had people compliment my Russian, at which point I would say my mother and father would be very thrilled. And then once someone said, "But tell me, why do you speak such old-fashioned Russian?"
Ah.
And I said, because my parents were old-fashioned folk. Classical education.
Right.
What does that mean in the case of throughout the world? Classical educations for my father, it was 9 years of Latin and 7 years of Greek, among other things.
Yeah.
Why? My father said, just in case. That was the notion of a classical education.
Right.
So for your grandmother, it's an absolutely real experience that the change of language doesn't touch some people.
Right.
One has to say, however, that the Russian spoken by and large in Russia today is crude.
Okay.
It is, among the educated, of course, it's educated Russian. But the populace doesn't speak, I guess you'd call it a good Russian.
Okay.
It's disrespectful of the beauty of the language, even though students do still study the classics
Right.
and seriously study
Right.
them. I mean, you mention to any high school student in Russia today, The Lady with the Little Dog, and they will know exactly what you're talking about because they probably would have read it.
Well, so that brings up this fact that, bizarrely enough, but pleasantly enough, that education in Russian you received from your own parents
Yes.
was probably the best education to confront the language of Chekhov.
I think you're right. I think you're right, because with my father and mother, I did read some Chekhov. I read Turgenev with them. Not so much Tolstoy. And a lot of the reading I did when I finally, was
Right.
on my own and working here in New York.
Right.
Even though I had had the job on a couple of occasions, first with NBC News, when I spent a summer in Moscow, of functioning as a, forgive me, interpreter. And it's interesting when you're listening to people speaking other languages, when you suddenly say to the person who's waiting for you to tell them what they said, what they mean is, and be interrupted and say, "Don't tell me what they mean, tell me what they said."
Okay.
And the key to rendering a foreign language into ours is no, capture what did they mean, which gets us back to my first point.
Exactly.
What is the intention? Because Chekhov's intentions are clear throughout. And I think the film that we've all seen
Right.
this evening, for better or for worse, highlights this question of intentions.
Okay. So let's start with what you perceive, because you're someone who has studied and read the short story in the original. What are Chekhov's intentions for someone who's reading it in the Russian?
My impression of the story is that a man who is living a certain life in Moscow at a certain time, which is towards the end of the 19th century, and who does not have basic respect for women, and I'll get to that in a moment because
Okay.
it's a key point about him, finds himself, whether he likes it or not, unexpectedly feeling something.
Right.
And Chekhov shows us a man who ultimately doesn't resist those feelings and reaches out, now with the woman whom he loves dearly, to hope. Now, the film at the end, for me, does not suggest that they have the right to hope.
Absolutely the case. In the last shot of the film is actually a famous shot of the film of the notion that the architectural space is the equivalent of the emotional entrapment and dead end therein.
And it is not in the story. It is not in the story. But before talking about some of these realization questions of Kheifits,
right,
the director who also did the screenplay, I think we have to talk about what your overall subject is, which is what was it like making movies under the Soviets?
Right. And
who
this
was
is
around?
Yeah.
I mean, Kheifits had a career where he made 33, 34 films. His first one, I think, was in 1928, a documentary. His last was in 89. By the late 80s, you know, happily he was able to make a film.
Right.
Then. There would have been a different kind, not of pressure, but of expectation. And the late 20s were a time of great creative fervor in the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
The clampdowns hadn't begun. My father in the late 20s was working there and wrote once that suddenly the bureaucratic complexities increased and the artistic concerns decreased. He left in 29,
Okay.
ostensibly on a conducting tour with 2 suitcases. My wife, interesting that confusion. My mother, his wife, it's how he put it. My wife comes with me and the suitcases. In 29, the notion being that he'd come back.
Right.
And didn't. And a lot of people knew that he wasn't going to come back, but the opportunity to be openly creative had been reduced, let's say. I have to assume that when Kheifits was working on most of his films, there would be the presence of someone whom I met and was introduced to in the late 80s when I was working on a screenplay in the Soviet Union, who was the assigned ideologue. My first reaction was, oh, is this a man who's going to check to see if everything is correct? I was bold enough at that time to say it because it was the time of Gorbachev and it was perestroika and openness, glasnost, you know, all that sort of stuff. And the story editor said, no, actually, he's going to be helpful. And in fact, he, in terms of the text at that time, was the most, not only helpful, but the boldest.
Interesting.
And I said to her, he can afford to be. And she said, now he can. Let's go back to the possible experience in the late 50s of realizing the lady with the little dog. Kheifits, I have to assume, understood that he has to give us a man, the upper middle classes, who himself is not living a dissolute life, but is surrounded by some dissolute people.
Okay.
We meet them first in Yalta because they are back in Moscow. We see them again. They aren't in the story. They aren't in the short story identified, nor are we aware of anyone at the beginning of the short story other than him and then her. That's it. We're asked during the course of the film to see some examples because the director feels obliged. I can't presume to say that he was pressured, but he understands that he has to show us that these aren't great people.
Okay.
They aren't wonderful people. There is the really terrible scene where he's with, in the film, the companion who has a lot of money. And at first I thought, wants to be alone with Gurov and throws the fork across the room to make the lackey leave with it, and then when he brings a clean one, throws it again. None of that is in the short story. One of the key moments for me in terms of presenting in Soviet times who these upper classes were and how, not hopefully doomed they were, but incapable of grasping the social realities of their times, is when she is going upstairs in the hotel. She stops and asks if there's any mail for her. There's a letter for her. And then the man at the desk takes a phone call. And we hear him say that yes, there are 2 seats on the railway carriage. It's first class. And then he has to explain, not to us, but to the Soviet audience of the day, so they know exactly who he is, by inference, being critical of. In first class, your seats face forward. None of that is in the short story. One of the most telling things that's missing from the movie is in the very opening paragraphs of Chekhov's story, where in talking about Gurov and the fact that early on he began having affairs, it then says his opinion of women. And it is the second sort of dialogue quote of Gurov's when he calls them inferior race.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Right.
Now, women in Soviet times could not be perceived as being inferior.
Right. Absolutely.
Equality, equality, equality.
Right.
But I think there is sufficient evidence to support the fact that in their public utterances, in various ways, the Soviets were prim.
Oh, very much so.
So that in the film, we are presented with Anna, who has to be punished. She can't possibly be happy. And her sense of I guess, damnation cannot be in any way alleviated by his unexpected love for her.
Okay.
I mean, Chekhov is very clear in the moment when in the hotel in Yalta he has slept with her, and then she's talking about how upset he is, and he cuts himself a piece of watermelon. And in Vladimir Nabokov's absolutely brilliant analysis of this story, which is part of his lectures on Russian literature that he delivered at Cornell, and which have been published.
Absolutely.
And than which your audience could not do badly at all, but to get and read.
I have no problem recommending the literary criticism of Vladimir Nabokov any day of the week.
He talks about this moment of the watermelon as being a key revelation about him, that it is an indifference on his part that he's not aware of. And it links later to the moment when back in Moscow, Gurov is dying to tell someone that he has met this amazing woman. And I don't think the word amazing is unfair, though it's very contemporary. And he says it to a friend from the club. And it's the Doctors Club, by the way, that they're leaving. It's clearly called the Doctors Club. To which his friend replies, "You were right before, the sturgeon was too salty." It's these two food references. When Gurov goes to, in the short story, it's the city S. And in the movie, Kheifits calls it, I just forgot what he calls it.
Is it Saratov?
Yeah, Saratov, right. Anna comes and sees him several times, and he makes several trips. And it's always a letter, you know. There is no interception of the letter. There is no misdelivery of the letter.
Oh, okay.
And what they're really trying to do is, do we have lives together?
Right.
Because Gurov's wife we meet visually, and she has one line of dialogue in the whole thing. There is no music, evening musicale. and things of that sort. There is Gudov walking with his daughter, and she wants to know why it's snowing.
Right.
And that precedes a rather remarkable paragraph where, and I don't know if it's really adequately realized in the film, but Chekhov says that Gudov felt he was two people. He felt he was two people. The open one that everybody knew and understood was this and this, but then he had a secret life that it was really he. And when I reread the Russian version again, I thought, Don Draper, Mad Men.
Right.
The real life that nobody realized now, and the apparent life. And it was the real life that he was looking for. That is, Gudov's transformation, and I think it's legitimate to call it that, he suddenly felt he had an opportunity for authenticity. Now, Kheifits, as some directors do, unfortunately, by choice or by necessity, or maybe even by inability,
Right.
sometimes tell us what we're supposed to think. They want to help us reach conclusions.
Which is exactly what Chekhov doesn't want to do in his art.
Chekhov shows us these people. He makes no judgments. And in all of Chekhov's work, including, I don't know why I'm saying including his really terrifying short story, The Black Monk, Chekhov just shows. He never tells. Therefore, he makes no judgments on his people, all of whom he loves deeply.
And which classifies him as a lyrical artist, a person who wishes to get inside and inhabit the characters to show us who they are.
Yeah.
And if I may say so, what you were saying much earlier, well, Kheifits is moved away. This is certainly a psychological film in a number of ways, but he puts that psychology in the context of his class critique, which comes as which is a standard Marxist manner of approaching something, whereas what you're talking about is the way in which Chekhov goes further and further into the experiential complexity, you'd have to say it, of the characters.
He does, and yet he does it with absolutely the most essential elements of the highest art, which is utter simplicity.
Right.
There are no embellishments in Chekhov. And to achieve that is almost to try and understand how it was the later in life Bach continued to compose, the more reduced to its absolute essentials his music became. This story, which Nabokov calls one of the greatest ever written, is rich with these apparent simplicities that never fail to be just life.
Right.
Few artists touch life. And the end of the story and the end of the film are two different things. Because at the end of the story, they are together again, and they are convinced now that there is a future for them,
Right.
that something lies ahead. They don't know when it will come, and Chekhov says that they understand that the most difficult time lies ahead. In the film, visually, Kheifits separates them.
Right, absolutely.
And it's the only time he puts them together during Gudov's trip to Saratov, so that he sees her only the once, they say whatever they would say to each other, and then they part, and there is the distance. And we are visually being told, no way, they're doomed.
Because they're doomed because they are members from the point of view of Soviet historiography, and how the history of the 19th and 20th century is to be or was written. They are doomed representatives of a doomed class. There is something coming, and that will be the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state. And there's an implicit view here that, okay, we know what the future is and we know what will happen to them. There, people like this will be swept away.
Absolutely swept away. Kheifits did an adaptation of Chekhov's short story, The Duel.
Yes, indeed.
And there again, there is that layer that it's not just the obsession of something which goes on and on and on, but that the individuals are doomed.
Right.
And that some part of why they're doing this is not a higher obsession or a passion, but because of their social situation.
Absolutely. George, I'm going to have to stop you because you know what? We're doomed to finish this conversation now because we've run out of time. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque or about, more generally, CUNY TV, there's a good way to find it. And it's no surprise, it's the internet. Please visit us at www.cuny.tv. You'll find there information about City Cinematheque, our upcoming screenings. You can send us an email. There are links there, and get on our e-list. And also you can find about the other programming on CUNY TV. So please visit www.cuny.tv. George, I want to thank you for being here, bringing what I think is not only great critical acumen, but a really unique perspective as a translator who's also a working screenwriter. And it's been a true pleasure, and I look forward to other opportunities to chat.
The pleasure's been mine, because any opportunity to have to go back and reread Chekhov in Russian is not a have to, it's a privilege. And to connect the conversation with the film that you've shown is particularly special. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today. I hope you'll tune in coming weeks as we stroll through the archives of film history. Bye-bye for now.